One second. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفعالنا ولا تأخذنا بقصورنا وذنوبنا بل أرحمنا وكن معنا وسهل علينا الطريق إليك الطريق إلى القبول. So we wanted to return back to the book مرات الطلاب by Shaikh Uthman and Fodio. It's an extremely important book given the way that he has structured it, in that he sets out to accomplish a number of different aims. One is to facilitate for the student of knowledge, and that's why you find that the book is brief, and likewise it focuses on that which is essential, foundational to know with regard to the evidences that are referential for different subject matters or different areas of knowledge. And what that means, simply put, is that Sheikh Uthman Fodio isn't only uh, teaching ideas, but he's also showing what is the basis for those ideas. In other words, in Islamic knowledge, you have two different types of evidence. One is called transmitted evidence, which comes from the Quran and the Sunnah, and the other is rational evidence. Sometimes we have become accustomed, unless you have broken out of that mold, to read or study, especially traditional texts. And those texts are studied, but there's very little reference to the evidences that support the claims that are made therein. Not all traditional texts are written in that way, but what is popular is written in that way because the idea is to simplify concepts, supposedly. But what Sheikh Uthman then Fodio does is that he introduces to the student of knowledge what are the evidences that support certain positions. So that's an important concept to understand and comprehend. The other thing that he does is that he keeps the differences amongst the scholars to a minimum, and he tries to flush out what is a dominant opinion so that that dominant opinion can serve as the insights into those evidences that he provides. So he's not only providing evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah, but he's also talking about or relating what it is that some scholars have said. And the clarity that he provides is intentional. It's a clarity that is there for the purpose of education, for the purpose of education. He's aiming to educate the students in that knowledge which is foundational. He begins the book with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama taslima. قال العبد والفقير المضطر لرحمة ربه عثمان بن محمد بن فوض عثمان المعروف بابن فوضي تغمده الله برحمته يمين. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد، فهذا كتاب ميراث الطلاب في مستند أبواب للدين الله الوهاب. ألفته لبيان مستند أبواب دين عز وجل، وهو ما قاله عز وجل في كتابه وما قاله رسوله عليه الصلاة والسلام في سنته، وما قاله علماء سنة رسول الله من الصحابة والتابعين والتابعي التابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين في باب الاجتهاد والاستنباط. So I want to pause there for a moment. So basically, Shaykh Uthman Fodio was saying that he composed this book for clarifying what are the referential sources for various chapters of knowledge or various subject areas of knowledge. And these subject areas of knowledge serve as introductions or gateways into a more deeper understanding of the deen. But he based himself on the book and the Sunnah and the statements from the scholars of the Sunnah, from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een and those who follow them in matters which are considered to be open to research and necessitating that we reflect on how it is that the deen applies to these areas. And that's why it says, في باب الاجتهاد والاستنباط. Right? And then he says, وليس ذلك مختص بالأبواب بل كل مسألة من مسائل أبواب الدين. I'm sorry. بل كل مسألة من مسائل أبواب الدين الله تعالى مستندة لما ذكر. So it clarifies more with the rest of the sentence. وإنما اقتصرنا على بيان مستند الأبواب دون المسائل لأننا لو أردنا أن نبين مستند المسائل الأبواب فرائض الأعيان فقط لاحتجنا إلى مجلدات. So basically he's saying that what I have focused on is core areas in various areas of knowledge without going into more details on these issues. Because if I were to go into details on these issues, then that would require me to compile volumes, in other words. So we mentioned that last time, but I wanted to focus on that point a little bit on the nature of the text. So I'm going to skip down further, and he's going to talk about the different stages of knowledge. And in this regard, he's quoting Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq, who was known to be a reformer. Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq was a reformer, a muslih, in the area of what is popularly called tasawwuf. Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq found that there were some errors, some problematic practices and ideas that were current among some groups that were claiming to practice tasawwuf. So he set out to reform. He set out to reform. And in the process of reforming, he ended up distancing himself from various groups. And then he ended up making sure that he left behind a set of teachings which embodied or which captured the philosophy of reform, especially in matters of understanding the different areas of knowledge, such as the way that fiqh relates to the fiqh being the knowledge of the halal and haram, how it is that it relates to the idea of purification of the self or spirituality and so on and so forth. So Sheikh Ahmed Zarouk, he begins the idea that is presented here with قل هذه قال الله تعالى قل هذه سبيلي أدعو إلى الله على بصيرة أنا ومن اتبعني. So this ayah of the Quran is saying, say that are called to my way, right? That this way that are called to is calling to Allah with insight. I follow up on this path as well as those who follow me. And that's a general translation of the Quran to give the flavor. The idea here is that the da'wah or education of the deen overall, and da'wah, a lot of people get into the debate with regard to what da'wah is. And some people like to focus the da'wah on the concept of what? They like to focus the da'wah on the concept of only calling the non-Muslims into the fold of Islam, so to speak. But when we study the life of the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, we gain the insight that the da'wah has everything to do with the whole of the deen. It has to do with every aspect of building up the deen. But in this case, the da'wah here is calling the people to the knowledge of the deen, and so it's done with basira or insight. And that requires people to have an understanding of the deen. That requires people to have an understanding of the deen. And so Ahmed Zarouk, as a reformer, that's one of the things that he wants to initiate. He wants to initiate an educational reform. And part of the educational reform that he initiates is making sure that people are in a mode where they're basing themselves on a solid understanding of the deen before believing anything or practicing anything. So knowledge becomes a prerequisite to belief and practice. Right? So the idea of the ayah here, as uh, Sheikh Ahmed Zarouk presents it in Umdat al-Murid al-Sadiq, right? And the reliance of those uh, who are truthfully seeking, that the ayah establishes فتبين أن التبصر في الدين أصل من أصوله, that the idea of understanding with insight, it's not just an issue of understanding, but an understanding with insight. The issue of basira is to comprehend with insight. And what that basically is pointing to is that it's not only having the knowledge of where something is coming from in Islam, like what is the basis of it, is the Quran, the Sunnah, but also what does it mean and how to implement it, right? Which is a higher level of education, right? But the idea here is that Islam is pushing this concept overall, that we're just not following Islam without understanding, or we're not just following Islam with an immature level of knowledge, but that we're understanding Islam so that we benefit from it and we know how to implement it in our lives and do so in a way that respects what it is that Islam is asking us, rather than just bring what we think Islam is asking us, but respect what Islam is asking us. And in that regard, Islam is seeking our interests. So the idea of belief and practice in the deen is always going to be in the interest of the human being, because part of the principle of Tawheed, or believing in the oneness of God, is that Allah doesn't need our worship. Our worship in our practice of the deen, in our study of the deen, and so on and so forth, is for our interest as human beings. But Allah Ta'ala is free of need. Allah is free of imperfection. Allah is free of dependence. So we're the ones that depend upon Allah Ta'ala. Our worship of Allah And our understanding the deen is, in many instances, bringing benefit to us, right? Bringing benefit to us. And so here, the idea of understanding with insight, he's saying that it is a foundational principle from the foundations of the deen. So let's read the translation as it's set out. In the name of Allah, the most beneficial, the most merciful. May Allah send blessings upon our Master Muhammad, his family, and companions, and give them peace. I say the poor slave, which he's talking about himself, who is in need of the mercy of Allah, Uthman, the son of Muhammad, the son of Uthman, known as Ibn Fudi, or then Fodio, or the son of Fodio. May Allah engulf him in his mercy. I mean, all praises are due to Allah. Rabbul Alameen, may blessings and peace upon Muhammad, the master of the messengers, and upon his family and his companions be communicated. To continue, this book is called The Mirror of the Students. Regarding the references of the knowledge of the Deen of Allah, the one who's the benefactor or the one who is the bestower. He says, I have composed this work in order to clarify the sources of the various areas of the Deen, right? Abwab Deen. And the translator here says the legal sources, but in reality, he's doing more than just talking about that. So it's he gave it that translation because a lot of the sections deal with matters of halal haram. But the reality here is that the book is more than just talking about halal haram, and the actual translation is Abwabuddin, right? And so he says that these sources for that type of knowledge are the book of Allah, what Allah says in the Quran, what Allah says what Allah says in the Quran, and what His Messenger has said as well, is that which was transmitted by scholars of the Sunnah from the companions and the generation that followed them, the Tabi'een, and those that follow the Tabi'un, or those that commit to them until the day of judgment. And they deal with the areas of knowledge which have to do with uh, ijtihad and istinbat, meaning that these are areas of knowledge which they need some thought, they need some reflection, and I mentioned that before. That these are areas of knowledge which need to be understood how it is that they apply, because it's not just a clear cut concept that's being presented, or it's not something that is unchanging. Right? These sections that we're going to be dealing with are areas of knowledge that we need to know what is the foundation for these areas of knowledge, whether it is what is the basis of Iman, or what is the basis of Salah, or what we mean by what is the basis is why it is that we practice that, why it is that Islam, is telling us to practice it. So that takes two types of knowledge. That takes one is to see what is the evidence for that practice or that belief in the Quran and the Sunnah, and then two, how it's understood and the wisdom behind it, right? And then how to extract from it, how to uh, see how it is that applies to changing circumstances. And Sheikh Uthman bin Fodio mentioned that he's only going to give us the foundational evidences for these various areas of knowledge that he's going to present, because if he's going to go into detail, then the book is going to be too bulky, too worked out, too long, and that's not the point. The point is just to familiarize ourselves with those foundational evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah for various practices of the Deen. Of those practices, I mentioned some, but he deals with things like just the basics, of fasting, the basics of marriage, the basics of uh, Islamic economic transactions, and so on and so forth. And he also touches on some points of spirituality. So, in all of those different areas of knowledge and other areas which I haven't talked about, he presents some statements from the Quran and the Sunnah and the scholars, and then he gives a very basic understanding of what those evidences or those pieces of knowledge mean. And then it is left up to the student of knowledge to understand those things and then to further deepen their knowledge versus just telling you Salah is an obligation and there's five prayers that are obligatory each day, and this is the name of them. He's going to give you an ayah of the Quran which talks about the prayer being an obligation. He's going to give you a hadith which is going to clarify for you how many prayers are obligatory. He's going to present to you some statements of the scholars which speak on the ayah of the Quran and hadith. So that's why the approach is a little different because he's grounding what it is that he's saying in knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah. And so he says, however, I have restricted myself. I have restricted this particular work to clarifying the evidences of the key major subjects of the religion, disregarding the detailed issues. This is because if the aim desire were to clarify those uh, detailed evidences for all the detailed issues with regard to the obligations that are the obligations of each individual, then we would need a number of different volumes or innumerable volumes to be able to deal with that. And so that's just a reiteration of what was said before. And then I just wanted to quote from Sheikh Zarruq again. So Sheikh Zarruq, he quotes Sheikh Uthman and Fodio quotes from Sheikh Zarruq so that he can present what kind of philosophy it is that he's using in this book as far as the educational idea, or as far as like how does he want us to think about education. So he says, Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq quotes the ayah of the Quran, say this is the way, say this is my way, I invite to Allah with insight, I and those who follow me. So then further he says, Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq says regarding the above ayah of the Quran in the book Umdat al-Murid al-Sadiq, this ayah uh, clarifies that insight of tabassur or research insight into the religion is a foundation of the religion itself from among other foundations. Right? And so he further goes to say that whoever deduces matters regarding Islam from your own opinion out of ignorance is not a true follower, right, of the Prophet ﷺ, because the deen of Islam is based on knowledge. So the idea here, we have to go back to the point that if we look at Surah Al-Fatiha outlines three different paths of knowledge, and may Allah make it easy for us. In Surah Al-Fatiha, we're asking Allah, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. And so there's one path that's considered to be the path in which the blessings of Allah Ta'ala are bestowed upon that person. And that person has knowledge and insight and acts upon that knowledge and insight. And so we find in some of the clarifications of the Quran, the tafsir literature, the idea of those who have incurred the wrath of Allah or the anger of Allah are those who have knowledge and don't practice. And the idea of those who are astray are those who don't practice with knowledge. Right? And so here the presentation that's being given is those who have insight into the deen are those who are following the deen. Right? You having insight and following it up with practice. And so we end this week with this, and we'll follow up inshallah next week. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to have mercy on us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.